There is a particular kind of pause certain men fall into, not the pause of someone who has nothing to say, but the pause of someone who suddenly has too much to say and no safe way to say it. If you've ever watched a man go quiet mid-sentence, his eyes drifting somewhere you couldn't follow, then what you're about to hear might finally put language to something you've only ever felt. A man carrying real emotional attachment rarely tells you directly. He does not usually sit you down and explain what is happening inside him, because most of the time, he doesn't fully understand it himself. He was never taught the vocabulary for it. But there is one behavior, one very specific and very human moment that almost every emotionally attached man eventually gives you, whether he intends to or not. And once you learn to spot it, you'll never read a quiet man's silence the same way twice. Because here is the truth, almost nobody tells you, emotional attachment does not usually announce itself. It leaks. It escapes through small cracks in composure long before it ever escapes through words. Most people misread emotional attachment in men because they are looking for the wrong evidence. They expect grand gestures. They expect constant messages, obvious affection, declarations. But real masculine psychology rarely behaves like that, especially not in men who were raised to equate control with safety. Many boys are taught early that softness is a liability. Stay composed, stay useful, stay unreadable. And so by the time these boys become men, vulnerability doesn't disappear, it simply learns to hide better. Which means emotional attachment, when it finally does happen, has to find another way out. And it does, through one specific sign. The sign is this: he lets you catch him unguarded. Not once, dramatically, but repeatedly, in small, unscripted moments he never planned for you to witness. A pause before he answers a simple question. A flicker of hesitation when you ask how he's really doing. A sentence he starts and doesn't finish, because finishing it would mean admitting something he isn't ready to admit out loud. A man who feels nothing for you will keep his composure intact around you effortlessly. A man who has become emotionally attached will, sooner or later, let that composure slip, and he won't always notice that it happened. Stay with me, because this next part explains why this specific leak only happens with people who actually matter to him. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the persona, the curated self we present to the world to stay safe, accepted, and in control. Beneath that persona sits what Jung called the shadow, everything a person has learned to hide, including tenderness, fear, longing, and need. For most of his life, a guarded man keeps his shadow locked away from almost everyone. But attachment changes the architecture of that hiding place. When someone becomes emotionally significant to him, his shadow starts pressing against the persona from the inside, looking for an exit. And the exit it finds is rarely a confession. It's a crack. You'll notice it in small, almost invisible ways. He remembers something you mentioned in passing weeks ago, something too minor for a disinterested mind to bother keeping. He asks a question that reveals he's been quietly turning your last conversation over in his head, even though he insisted at the time that it didn't matter. He goes quiet in a way that feels different from disinterest, heavier, more present, like he's holding something back rather than having nothing to offer. None of this is loud. All of it is real. This is where a lot of people get confused, because withdrawal and disinterest can look almost identical from the outside, but they come from completely different places. A man who feels nothing withdraws because there is nothing pulling him back. A man carrying genuine attachment sometimes withdraws precisely because there is too much pulling him back, and that pull frightens him. Attachment introduces risk into a nervous system that has spent years avoiding it. Suddenly there is something to lose. Suddenly silence from you lands differently than silence from anyone else. Suddenly his own reactions surprise him, and that unpredictability can make an otherwise steady man feel unsteady around the one person he can't quite explain his way out of caring about. So he starts protecting himself the only way he knows how, by tightening his composure everywhere except in the moments that catch him off guard, which is exactly why the sign shows up in glimpses instead of declarations. You won't get a speech. You'll get a look that lasts a half-second too long. You'll get a joke that almost covers something real, except it doesn't quite land. And for a second, his face says more than the joke did. You'll get him showing up in a small, practical way, remembering you don't like a certain restaurant, noticing you seem tired before you've said anything, adjusting his plans slightly around yours without making it a whole conversation. Attachment rarely performs. It just quietly rearranges his instincts. It's worth separating this from something that can look similar but isn't: performance. Some people learn to fake vulnerability strategically, offering just enough softness to seem trustworthy without ever actually risking anything. The difference is consistency under conditions that don't benefit him. A performed crack shows up when it's convenient, when it might win him something. A genuine one shows up at inconvenient times too. In the middle of an argument he'd rather win, in a moment when staying guarded would clearly serve him better. Real attachment doesn't check whether the timing is strategic. It just leaks anyway, which is precisely what makes it worth trusting. How visible this sign becomes often depends on where a man learned his emotional habits in the first place. A man raised in a household where feelings were spoken about openly may let his guard down more easily and more often, even if the underlying attachment isn't especially deep. A man raised in a quieter, more stoic environment might hold the mask far longer, which means when the crack finally does appear, it tends to carry more weight, not less. Context matters here. The absence of frequent emotional openness in a guarded man doesn't mean less attachment. Sometimes it means the opposite. The walls were simply built more carefully, over more years, by someone who learned early that letting them down was costly. And there's something deeper happening underneath all of this. When a man becomes attached to someone, that person's emotional state starts to register inside his own nervous system almost automatically. Your bad day becomes something he notices without being told. Your distance becomes something he feels, even when he can't articulate why it's bothering him. Psychologists sometimes call this emotional co-regulation, one nervous system beginning to sync with another's. It isn't a decision he makes, it's something attachment does to him, whether he wanted it or not. This is also why emotionally attached men so often become quietly protective. Not possessive, not controlling, but attentive in a way that surprises even them. He starts noticing when you seem off. He starts caring, on some private level, whether you're okay, even on days that have nothing to do with him. And when someone else's well-being begins shaping your own internal weather like that, something has already shifted beneath the surface, whether he's said a word about it or not. Here's what makes all of this harder for him. Many men were never given permission to feel this deeply in the first place, let alone to talk about it. So when real attachment does arrive, it often collides with years of conditioning that told him feelings this size were dangerous. One part of him wants to move closer. Another part of him is quietly terrified of what closeness might cost him if it goes wrong. This internal tug-of-war is why a genuinely attached man can seem warm one day and strangely distant the next, not because his feelings are unstable, but because he is still learning how to carry them without dropping the mask he's relied on his whole life. But underneath the inconsistency, when the attachment is genuine, one thing tends to hold steady. He keeps coming back to the crack. Even after pulling away, even after a stretch of silence he can't fully explain, something in him keeps returning to the same unguarded moments, with you specifically. He'll ask the question again. He'll let his guard slip again. He'll show you, in some small, unrehearsed way, that you're still occupying space in him that he hasn't figured out how to close off. That return is the real signature of attachment. Not perfection, not constant closeness, but a pattern of coming back to honesty with you, even when honesty costs him something. Jung believed that real psychological growth, what he called individuation, couldn't happen in isolation. It required contact with another person willing to reflect parts of the self back that had been buried for years. In that sense, the people we become attached to aren't incidental to our growth, they're often the catalyst for it. A man who lets you glimpse his shadow, even briefly, is doing something that costs him more than it might look like from the outside. He's allowing a version of himself he's spent years managing to exist, however briefly, in front of another person. That's not a small thing, even when it looks like nothing more than a pause, a half-finished sentence, or a longer than usual silence. There's a reason this matters so much to men specifically. Many of them go through most of their adult lives being asked to provide, perform, and hold everything together without ever being asked how they're actually doing underneath it. So when a man finally feels safe enough around someone to let his composure genuinely slip, even just a little, even just for a moment, that isn't nothing. That's often the closest thing to "I trust you" that certain men know how to offer. His nervous system, so used to staying braced, finally exhales slightly around you, and that exhale is what you're catching in those small, unguarded moments. This is also why attachment tends to reveal itself most clearly during difficult moments rather than easy ones. Anyone can seem warm when things are going well. The real test is what happens after tension, after a disagreement, after a stretch where things felt off between you. A man who feels nothing will simply let the distance sit there indefinitely. A man who is attached will, in his own time and often clumsily, find a way back, a message that pretends to be about something small, a conversation that circles back to what actually happened, an effort to repair rather than disappear. Watch what he does after things get hard. That tells you more than anything he says when things are easy. Pride complicates this enormously, especially for men who were taught that needing someone is a weakness rather than simply a fact of being human. A man can be deeply attached and still hesitate to show it, not because the feeling isn't there, but because admitting it feels like handing someone a part of himself he's spent years protecting. So instead of saying it, he shows it in fragments, in how he listens a little more closely when you talk, in the way his humor softens around you specifically, in the way he seems to brace slightly whenever your name comes up in a way that suggests distance or disappointment. These fragments add up to something even when no single one of them feels like proof on its own. There's also something worth naming honestly here. Attachment doesn't automatically make a man emotionally healthy or ready. Some men carry old wounds, a past betrayal, an early experience of being let down by someone they trusted, that shape how they handle new closeness. A previously hurt man might crave connection and quietly brace for it to disappear at the same time. Unless he does the work of recognizing that pattern, he may keep repeating it in every relationship that starts to matter to him. This is where real emotional growth becomes necessary. Not just noticing the shadow, but actually sitting with it long enough to understand what it's protecting him from. That work is hard, and not every man does it. But the men who do tend to become something specific, quietly gentler, not because they've become weaker, but because they've stopped treating vulnerability as the enemy. Their tone changes around the people they trust. Their reactions become less defensive and more thoughtful. They start choosing their words more carefully, not out of fear, but out of care, because somewhere along the way, they learned that the people who matter most deserve more than their guarded default setting. Take a moment and think back. Was there a version of him that only ever showed up with you? A softness that disappeared the moment someone else walked into the room? A question he asked that had clearly been sitting with him for longer than he let on? A silence that felt less like absence and more like someone working up the nerve to say something real? If any of that sounds familiar, you were likely watching this exact pattern unfold in real time, long before you had language for it. So if you're trying to figure out whether a man is genuinely attached to you, stop searching for grand declarations. Look instead for the crack. Look for the moment his composure slips just slightly and he lets you see something he didn't plan to show you. Look for whether he keeps returning to that same unguarded honesty again and again, even when it would be easier for him to simply stay closed off. Because that pattern, imperfect, inconsistent, occasionally clumsy, but persistent, is usually the most honest thing an emotionally attached man will ever tell you, even if he never says the words out loud. So what do you do with this once you see it? Not chase it. Not demand it show up on a schedule. The crack works precisely because it's involuntary. The moment you start expecting it, pressuring him to perform vulnerability on command, it tends to seal shut again, because now it's a request rather than something that happened naturally. The more useful move is simpler. Notice it, let him know in some quiet way that it was safe, and give him room to let it happen again without turning it into a conversation about why he doesn't do it more often. Emotional safety, more than pressure, is usually what widens the crack over time. Men who feel judged for their unguarded moments tend to seal them off faster than they open them. Men who feel met in those moments, without being cornered, tend to offer them more freely as trust deepens. This isn't about managing him or waiting patiently for scraps of honesty. It's about understanding that for many men, this slow unsealing is the only language of attachment they were ever given, and learning to read it fluently changes how you experience every quiet man who has ever mattered to you. There is something quietly significant about being the person someone lets their guard down around, even imperfectly, even inconsistently. It means, on some level, that you've become one of the few places where a version of him that usually stays hidden feels safe enough to exist. That isn't proof of a perfect relationship, and it isn't a guarantee of anything, but it is real information, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as overthinking. Trust what you noticed. Attachment rarely lies as convincingly as words can. And maybe, as you're listening to this, a particular face has already come to mind, a particular pause, a particular moment where someone let you see a little more than they meant to. If so, you already understand more about this than any explanation could add. Sometimes recognition arrives quietly, the same way attachment does, not as a sudden realization, but as something that's been sitting there the whole time, waiting for you to finally name it. If this gave you a new way of understanding the quiet men in your life, you're exactly who this channel exists for. Join us at Silent Resonance, where we sit with these hidden emotional patterns every week and try to make sense of what most people never explain out loud. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if a certain someone came to mind while you were listening, let us know in the comments below.